My name is Tom Gerard. I am the interviewer and a volunteer with the Biddeford Cultural and Heritage Center. It is Wednesday, October 23rd, and today I have the privilege of interviewing former Biddeford Mayor Alan Casavant. We are conducting this interview at Alan's home in Biddeford. Good afternoon, Alan.
Good afternoon.
And I'd like to begin by asking you where and when were you born?
I was born in July 1952 at Weber Hospital in Biddeford.
And can you tell us the story of how your family came to Biddeford? Any ancestry stories or anything of that nature?
My French side, the Casavant side, they came out of the Quebec area, and obviously they came to work in the mills. So my meme worked in the mills, and my Pepe worked in the mills, and eventually most of their kids worked in the mills too. The Chenards, my mother's maiden name was Chenard, they came from Quebec, and they also went to work in the mills in Saco Lowell. But that side gets a little bit interesting because my mother's mother was a CV, wasn't Franco. And her mother and father were Irish and English. And so when they got married, there was a little bit of a controversy because the Irish and the English really didn't get along very well. But when the two families met, the McCarrans or McCarns went to see the Seavies, and they had a party. And apparently it was a real good party because, well, they liked to party, so let them get married. That's also kind of important for me because my mother's side of the family, even though she was a Chenard, and my grandfather Chenard could speak French. Essentially, there was no French in that house whatsoever. So my mother never learned the language. And so the Casavant side of the family was all French. And we, my brother, my sister, and I, growing up, we never learned French. So going there, especially early on when we were really young, was awkward because all they spoke was French.
And what generation was the first generation to end up in Biddeford?
My grandparents.
Your grandparents.
Yeah, they came in roughly 1916, 1917.
Okay. And did you have relatives that you would visit in Canada or that came to Biddeford to visit you?
No, it's really weird. I think that because I wasn't connected so much to the Franco culture, we went to St. Mary's School, St. Mary's Church, didn't know French. There was no reason really to go back to Canada. Had relatives that came down to visit, Casavant side relatives, but I never knew any Chenard side relatives that lived in Canada at all. But we never did, sometimes people made pilgrimages on a yearly basis, and we never did that. We didn't have many French habits at all.
Do you have any connections with any of that family at all anymore that may be in Canada?
I don't. The last time I visited family in Canada was probably in the 1990s. And then pretty much it dried up.
Yeah. And do you have a story of how your parents met?
I have a vague understanding that they met through some other family members. But that's really all I know.
Nothing specific?
No, nothing specific.
Mm-hmm. And what did your parents do for work?
My mother was a housewife. She stayed in the home until my father passed, and then she went to work at first for Joe Saucier in the recreation department. She did his secretarial stuff for a little bit, and then she left that and went and did some babysitting for Dr. William Noyes and Nancy Noyes, who lived in the area, had a practice on Dental Avenue in Biddeford. She raised their kids. My father started off working in the mill and moved into the computer department, the IBM section. In fact, he used to tell a story about how once some guy came in, Roger, there's a new stock in the market. It's really, really cheap, and you should buy it. It was like 50 cents or $1 a share or something like that. And he figured it was just a gimmick. He blew it off. It was IBM at the time. It was selling at $500 a share when he told me the story.
Did he ever buy it?
He never bought it.
So how did your father learn IT? Was it he self-learning, or did he go to school for that?
He never went to school. I mean, he had a high school education, didn't go beyond that. I think he took a couple of classes or courses or something like that. He ended up fixing TVs, so he was natural that he worked for a guy named Dagno There used to be Degno's TV repair shop on Summer Street, across from where Alex Pizza is, and abutting the Biddeford House.
Yeah, I
Biddeford
remember
block.
that. Yeah.
In fact, that's my earliest memory, is living there, because we lived right next door to Degno's. And I remember playing outside on my bicycle with a kid that lived downstairs. And sometimes I remember on Friday nights there'd be fights upstairs, on TV. We had a TV for some reason, black and white, and my uncles would come and so forth. They'd all come to watch the Friday night fights. But that's my earliest memory, so I had to be somewhere like 4 or 5 when I remember that. But anyway, he learned the mechanics of fixing and repairing TVs, and I think that was helpful for him when he began to do the IBM stuff. So he did that in the mill, and then he left that fairly early, and he went to work in Maine Bonding and Casualty in Portland. And he was in charge of the data processing department there, and did that for a number of years. And then he began to splinter off and go into insurance, eventually ending up with Parkwood and Carroll, doing some selling and underwriting and things of that nature. He knew everybody in town, so he did really well doing that.
I'm sure. And how many siblings do you have?
I have a brother who's younger than me, and he's a carpenter by trade. And I had a sister, but she died when she was 9 of a brain tumor. So that was kind of a shock to the family, and I think it affected all of us for a long time.
Are you the oldest in the family?
Yeah.
Of the siblings? And did your grandparents, aunts, uncles, any of those type of relatives live close by?
Just about everybody lived close by. Back then, I don't recall many people leaving the Biddeford area. So there were a few. I had an uncle, Phil Chenard, that moved to Erie, Pennsylvania, because he worked for GE, and they moved him out there. And I had another aunt, Sister Ann Paul. She was a nun, and she's still alive. She's 90-something years old. And she moved wherever the order sent her. But generally speaking, most of my relatives were all in the Biddeford Saco area.
And did you have holiday family gatherings or summer picnic gatherings or anything like that?
When I was young, we would go to my Meme Casavant's house, which was on Mount Vernon Street on the 3rd floor, which is kind of an interesting story too, because she lived on the 3rd floor and she could not speak English. I think she understood, but she couldn't speak English. Her best friend lived downstairs on the 2nd floor. It was the Mantis family of Alex Pizza fame. And Mrs. Mantis spoke Greek and couldn't speak English. And yet somehow the two of them were best friends and communicated. But I remember going there anyway on Christmas and maybe Thanksgiving and having, all types of meals. And my Uncle Beeman's family was there. My Uncle Paul's family was there. And sometimes my Uncle Adrian, who was a priest, would be in the area as well. But on the Chenard side, we would go visit my Uncle Don Peanut and my Aunt Pat, who lived up on the mountain road, and my grandparents, Chenard, lived downstairs with them. So we'd go at Christmas time maybe Christmas Day, just to say hi and so on and so forth. And sometimes on Thanksgivings, we would alternate back and forth between my parents' house and their house. I was closer to the Peanuts than anybody else growing up.
Did your mom and dad come from big families?
My father was like 5 or 6 maybe, and my mother was a similar number.
And did their siblings end up in the Biddeford Saco area?
Yeah, they all did.
And how and where did you meet your wife?
I met her, believe it or not, online. Yeah. Through a online dating service. It was like 20 some odd years ago when we met, and we had a date in Portland and just seemed to hit it off at that point in time. And she's from Fort Kent, so the odds of that happening were probably somewhere between slim and none. But we had the same taste and the same interests, and we just communicated with each other really well. So we got married 10 years ago. So.
And you have a couple of stepchildren through your wife?
Yes.
And are they in the area?
Yes, Erin is in Saco, and she's been living there for maybe 2, 3, 4 years. And Ian lives in York.
Okay, so they're close by.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about your experiences growing up in Biddeford and how they've impacted you in life?
Like I said, my earliest memory is on Summer Street, but we moved to Graham Street, the intersection of Graham and Union, I think around 1956. My mother's cousin, Eleanor Flavin, owned an apartment building, and we moved there. I think it was like $30 a month or something like that. For it was really, really cheap. And so that's where essentially I grew up. And when I think back to that, Biddeford was really neighborhood centric. You lived in a particular area, and that's pretty much what you saw. So, for example, when someone said they lived in Westmore Avenue, I probably would have no idea where that was at that particular time, or whatever. But we had downstairs when we first moved there was the Arbor family, and I became friends with Mickey Arbor, who was my age. The interesting part was when I first met him, Mickey couldn't speak English; he spoke French. I suspect now he can't speak French, but speaks English. It just reversed itself. But we became good friends. And across the street was the Hool family. And we became very good friends with the Hools, all the kids and so forth. We used to play wiffle ball in my yard essentially all day long. And Dr. Hool once kind of like grudgingly complained to my father. He said, I don't understand, there's a big yard over here. My kids always want to be over there. My father would sit up in the window sipping a can of Knickerbocker beer. He'd be the umpire. And we just played all the time, and seldom strayed too far. I remember straying into Archie's Variety maybe for some soda or some candy or something like that, but we didn't go that far.
Did you guys hang out at Cliff Park or Mayfield at all during, when you were younger like that?
I loved baseball growing up. So Bob Cody had a summer league. That was Coach Cody.
Yeah. At Mayfield?
I was at Mayfield, so every summer, I'm not sure what age I was, we'll say 8, 9, 10, 11 or whatever, we played baseball. And in the afternoons, we'd go back and play baseball some more. Just take our bikes and go. Again, it was kind of freewheeling. There wasn't any sense of danger or anything like that, but yeah, Mayfield was special. Now, Clifford Park, I don't recall ever going there.
Yeah.
It's too far away.
Well, you're kind of in the middle there.
Yeah, but it's just, again,
yeah.
There were just certain places to go, and that's pretty much where we stayed.
And what about in the winter? I know you were in hockey at some point in Broomball. Did you skate in the winters?
We skated at St. Louis skating rink. A couple times I think I made it to Westbrook, but we did mostly St. Louis. And again, I remember I had 2 separate rinks, and it was maintained. They had to flood it, obviously, but they had to maintain it. Most of the kids had racers. We didn't. We had hockey skates.
I was going to ask you about that. I saw you in hockey.
Yeah, because we didn't have that much money. And so getting races, they were always more expensive, so my parents really couldn't afford that. So we did the hockey skates, and people kind of make fun of us and stuff like that because, and we weren't the speed skating types. Eventually we got the racer skates, when we became more self-sufficient.
Did you ever try participating in any of the races with your hockey skates?
I didn't, but my brother, I think, did. I remember my cousins doing that, but I was too embarrassed to do that.
I can remember a couple of people trying that every once in a while.
Yeah. But it was... so we're talking 1963, 64, 65, because I still remember going there and listening to Beatles tunes. Specifically, I remember I Feel Fine blaring over the speakers. Why I remember that, I have no idea, but I remember that.
Probably because they played it 50 times.
Could be.
3 hours you were there.
Yeah. But I did play hockey. I mean, I didn't start playing hockey until college. Roger LeBranch, who lived on my floor, and Roger's from Biddeford, Roger somehow got involved in a hockey game down by the river in Orono. There was an outdoor rink, and he managed to drag me along, and I loved it. You know, and that was my junior year in college, and I could skate, so that was fine, but I had to learn the game a little bit. And then when I went to my senior year, and I joined Phi Kappa Sigma, of all the time to do it, your senior year is not the time to do it, but I did anyway. I played on that team, which was intramural fraternity hockey, was extremely interesting.
I bet it was, and that just goes to show, we were 2 years difference at Orono, and there was no intramural hockey when I was there, so that
Yeah.
all started around when you were there.
Oh, I remember this one time that we played, well, a couple of stories about that anyway, sidebars. I remember our goalie, I won't mention any names, but he ends up becoming a dentist during warm-ups. He takes a slap shot to the head, splits his head open, this in warm-ups, and he goes to get stitches and then ends up coming back to play in the game. And I remember thinking, like, what the heck is he doing? But he did. And the other story I remember is there was this one, I don't remember what fraternity it was, but there was one kid, he wore number 4 in honor of Bobby Orr, and he was zigzagging all over the place. And one of the players on my team, who was a football player, had enough, and he threw down his stick and threw down his gloves and chased him right out the rink. And we saw him running away towards the river. That was the last we saw of him. Wow. The good old days.
And we'll come back to hockey, because I know you were coaching and everything.
Yeah.
When we start talking about those experiences. Movies, did you go to movies in downtown Biddeford at all when you were growing up?
Yeah. Not all the time, because again, our finances weren't exactly stable. I remember, for example, one birthday, my mother pulled me aside and said something to the effect, well, we didn't get much this year for you because we couldn't afford it. I got a bunch of balsa wood gliders. That was it. And I say that, but really when I think back, most of the people I hung around with were in the same boat. There wasn't too much wealth at all. People didn't have a lot of money. So movies we would occasionally go to. City Theater, we kind of stayed away from that one for the most part because it had kind of a bad reputation. So we would go to Central Theater. I remember seeing A Hard Day's Night there. Song of Bernadette, I remember going to see that there. I remember getting in trouble there because my brother and I went with the Hools, I think, and he had an asthma attack, and I essentially called my father, put him out in the street, went back to watch the movie, and left him outside by himself.
Do you remember at St. Mary's when they would have one like Song of Bernadette or the Ten Commandments, and they would bring the students down during the day one day to watch those type of movies?
I don't remember
That's
that.
not ringing a bell at all.
No.
No.
But I remember going. I'm sure it was advocated to go and stuff like that, or either by my mother or by the nuns. But I just remember going to see those specific, and of course Disney movies. Snow White and all those. We saw those too.
And speaking of St. Mary's Grammar School, what were your experiences being taught by the nuns?
Overall, pretty good. I never went to kindergarten, so my first year was first grade. And I remember walking down there and sitting in the class. I still remember exactly where I sat. And Sister Regina was the first grade teacher. And I liked her a lot. But I remember some kids having anxiety issues, and I couldn't understand that, which is really ironic because eventually I ended up having anxiety attacks in grammar school for crazy reasons. I can't even explain them. But Sister Regina was really good. I had Sister Agneta. She had a reputation of being really strict. I didn't really have a trouble with her for the most part. But that's when I started having some anxiety attacks. I remember being in for the St. Patrick's concert, and I was petrified of being abandoned by my parents for some crazy reason or something. And they had to be visible. I had to be able to see them on the stage. And so that was really tough. But then I had a Sister Martina in the third grade, and that just calmed me right down. I was all set. And then I had Miss Driscoll, who was really good. She was a public school teacher. She was because they began to have a shortage of nuns.
She must have been one of the first lay teachers at St.
Yeah,
Mary's.
I don't remember anybody before her, but she was really, really good. And that's where I met Roland Ian, who became one of my good friends in the 4th grade. He sat right behind me. And then later on, I had Sister Geraldine, who taught me how to write. And she was a real big inspiration because through her, I understood grammar, like music. It just, everything seemed to fit certain ways in the sounds and stuff, the sentence structure.
So when you say writing, you mean to write out, not just basic writing.
You learned, I was never good at the handwriting, but in terms of grammar and syntax and spelling, she was the one that really moved me in that particular direction.
When you look back at that, I mean, we had 3 Catholic grammar schools in Biddeford at that time, and I'm assuming St. Joseph's and St. Andrews was like St. Mary's, that the class sizes were big. There were big class, and you were teaching. When you look back at that, do you wonder how they really taught all those students at one time at all, and those different learning levels?
It's because you can't compare today to then. I mean, when I was teaching the high school, I would have up to 32 kids in a classroom. And, now it's like, we got to have 15 or we got to have 20, no more than that. So it's really different. But when you had 32, if you had a student that was acting up, the parents would generally back you up. And I mean, when I started teaching, the bad kids chewed gum or talked in class. That was it. Mm-hmm. You didn't have the social problems and all these other problems. And it was kind of funny because I used to bring kids to St. George, Quebec as an exchange. I remember walking in their classrooms, they were having 35 and 40 kids. But they were all sitting, they weren't saying a word, Yeah. So culturally, I think the culture's changed and it makes things a lot different. And of course, in a parochial school, if you acted up, there were consequences. Big time.
Do you think the education is any better today than it was back
No.
then, or just different? Or
No, I don't think it's as good. I think that kids today, they have more access to information, but in terms of connecting the dots, that's not there. They can go look something up on let's just talk history, for example, since that's what I taught. But if I gave a kid today an assignment to do something, we'll say on World War II, they could probably come up with something very easily getting it on the internet. But they might miss entirely all the events preceding World War II because those dots it's just not there, And I just, that's too bad. I just think that there's some big gaps in our education today. And again, it's cultural. It's just the way it is.
And thinking also, when we grew up, Biddeford was like, I think 90% Catholic. I don't know if that's an exaggeration or not, but it was pretty darn close to it. I think now it's different culture, much more mixed in terms of religions or non-religion or whatever. I mean, has that impacted Biddeford or the people living in Biddeford in different ways since then? Or
I don't think in that sense it has. I think that, again, if you look at Biddeford, when I first started teaching, or even before that, you had some very large families, so there was always some continuity. And again, parents were always involved, not dictating what a teacher taught, but there for support. They would say, my kid gives you any grief, let me know, that type of thing. What I saw happening is that parents became more and more distant, or some families became fractured, and that just compounded things. And then trying to but encourage teachers to deal with all the social and psychological problems, things that you would never see 30 years ago, now are commonplace in a classroom, and it makes it really difficult to teach.
And also, when you went to high school, Biddeford High School had a much larger student population than it does now, correct?
Well, I went before the merger.
Oh, that's right, you went.
Yeah, so I was the last one.
Yeah. So it was just a little bigger than it is now.
But when I started teaching, the class was between 1,400 and 1,425, 1,450. And now it's dipped well below 800. that's a big, big change, but you don't have those big, huge Franco families anymore. So if I had a Cody, for example, we'll say, one year, I might see 6 siblings along the way, and now you're not seeing that. And interestingly, again, if you go to a Biddeford athletic event or a graduation, you look at the surnames, the number of Franco names is diminished. We're not Franco anymore, even though because of mixed marriages, we'll say, they have Franco traditions. When I was teaching, for example, when I was teaching freshmen, we'd do something in terms of genealogy, ethnicity, and stuff like that. And I had kids that had French names that didn't know they were Franco. But they called their grandparents Meme and Pepe, they had pork pie, I mean, that type of thing. So the assimilation is just really complete, which is really unfortunate, I think. And
So you weren't impacted directly by the closing of St. Louis High School. How do you think, if you can look back at that, how did that impact the city? Do you think?
I think in retrospect, it was a huge loss. I don't think people fully understood the magnitude of the influence of St. Louis within the community of Biddeford. And whether the politics in Portland or whatever the cause was, that school provided an excellent education for a lot of kids. And I think that the void of that closure has never been filled. That's my thought.
Had you considered going there at all with your French background?
Early on, when I was at grammar school, that was my intention, but most of my friends were going to Biddeford. And I think out of my class at St. Mary's, only 2 kids, one of your cousins, actually Mark, went to St. Louis, but there's only 2 that actually ended up going there. The rest all went to Biddeford. And I'm not sure why. I don't know why I made that decision, but I think it was just because of my friends. My father went to Biddeford High too, so.
Well, that would be an influence.
Yeah.
Going back to Biddeford now, what about downtown? Did you hang out downtown very much and go into the stores and patronize Riley's and Alex Pizza around the corner from the Maine? I mean, any of those experiences stick out in your mind?
Riley's I patronized. Brud Riley, who was the owner at the time, it's Michael's father, was best friends with my uncle Dickie, who got killed in World War II. He was shot down over the Philippines. And so Brud knew my parents and knew the Chenard family pretty well. So my mother would give me a dime essentially every single day on my way to school, because again, I walked to St. Mary's. She'd give me a dime to go to Riley's Bakery for my dessert for lunch. And sometimes Brud would give me a deal, because normally 10 cents was an eclair or a cream roll, but there was a thing called a top hat, which was like 90% cream. And I'd eyeball that, and he'd say, would you like that? Yeah, but I only got a dime. I'll give you a deal. And he'd sell it to me. So Riley's was good, and sometimes my parents would buy donuts, we'd buy them on Saturday for church, after church on Sunday. Pizza, I was thinking about this recently. We rarely went out to eat because, again, that cost money. I mean, in high school, my junior and senior year, I'd spend more time maybe at Alex Pizza or something like that. But the local restaurants, very rarely went unless there was a major event like a wedding or an anniversary celebration at the Wonder Bar or something like that. The surplus store in Main Street I used to go to because that's when I was going to St. Mary's during recess at lunchtime. You could walk around. Nobody kept you on, Mark, Roland Ian, myself, we'd walk all over the place into Saco, and sometimes we'd walk into the surplus store because they had fishing hooks and things of that nature. Obviously, the MacArthur Library was a big attraction back then. Benoit's had Boy Scout stuff. Mark Gerard was in the Boy Scouts with me, and so we'd go in there and check that out. Go down to WIDE, because once the Beatles came out, all of a sudden now we're conscious of musical charts, so we go check out to see what was the #1 record and stuff like that.
Did you go into Murphy's and listen to the records in the booth?
Oh yeah. So there were certain things that we would do. And of course, I remember seeing my first color TV on Main Street at Warren's Furniture, Christmas shop with my mother. We walked by, and I was like bewildered and surprised because this had to be like 63, 64, 65, and because we had black and white, which most people did. But I was mesmerized. I just stood out there, and I remember it was even snowing, and just looking at this TV because I was so shocked by that.
How do you contrast? I mean, you remember the tail end of the height of Biddeford before the strip malls and mall came in, and it they started losing businesses. How do you contrast that with what's happening with Biddeford today, downtown Biddeford?
It's a renaissance of sorts, or a resurrection, but the bones were always there. Again, if you look at the architecture of the downtown, you just walk it. In fact, when kids messed up and did bad on a test and they needed extra credit, I told them to go walk down Main Street, look up and tell me what's up there. So, because the windows, or the design work of the roof, or the initialing, or even the Egyptian hieroglyphics on that building on Washington Street, they put that up there because when they were constructing it, King Tut's tomb got opened up or something like that. So they
is that the one across from the Wonderbar?
Yeah. So if you consider that to be the bones, that was always there. But you're right. What happened once the mills began going south, and the couple of recessions and so forth, and the mall opening up, a bit of a downtown died. And I remember there was a Look Up Biddeford campaign. This had to be in the 70s, maybe late 70s, early 80s, and it was a banner. And there was this old guy, I can't remember what his name was, but he had this checkered hat that he used to wear, and he'd shuffle up and down Main Street on a regular basis. And I think I was working for Neil Rold. So he had an office. He was running for Congress, and he had an office. So it had to be 78, 79. And I go out and I see him shuffling down, and he looks at, look up Biddeford, huh? Ha! Yeah. Biddeford's dead. What is there here? And he just kept walking. But that, I think, when I became mayor, I was convinced that could be reversed, because whenever I had students that weren't doing very well, sometimes it was a self-esteem issue. They didn't believe in themselves. So if I could convince them that they were really smart or talented or good or whatever, and if I could make them laugh, I had them. It was done. They would be okay. And so when I first became mayor, a department head pulled me aside and said, Alan, if you can do anything, just maintain a professional attitude so it's not like it has been in the past, so that people will start to invest here, which is what we tried to do. And at the same time, express optimism, express a vision. Yeah, we can be better. Let's create pride within the community, and so on and so forth. So with the Heart of Biddeford and city personnel, and the formula was there. It was just tapping into it. So the downtown of yesterday and the downtown of today, similar, not identical. Again, I think when you were growing up and I was growing up, the best part of Main Street was down by the library. That's where most of the major stores were and stuff. That was where the action was. It's kind of flipped to a degree that all the restaurants generally are down the other end, and that's been thriving, even though with Fish and Whistle and some of the other places now, the other end's starting to get resurrected. So there's still things lacking, like a clothing store, drug store, fruit and vegetable store. There's things that are needed because so many people are living in the downtown now. If you have those there and they have access, they don't have to use a car to drive around. So it's still a work in progress. And of course, with COVID and, even with inflation, it's putting a lot of pressure on all these merchants because they don't make a lot of money, really. And so keeping them above water is going to be tough.
Do you think the parking issue is solved now with the garage and some of the other parking lots within Biddeford Center?
I think it's a little bit better. The idea of having controlled parking is to get turnover, because one of the problems that people always complained about, they couldn't find a place to park. Because shopkeepers, store owners would just park their car on Main Street and move them 2 feet, and take valuable parking spaces. So it was really clear early on, and every single city that I know of has this issue. You got to have turnover to get people into the stores, because if they can't park, they ain't gonna shop. And the parking garage was part of that whole deal, but it also was part of the idea of creating a renaissance within the Mill District, because a lot of the things that we envisioned would never come if there was no parking in that particular area. Of course, even COVID kind of blew that up a little bit, because everything slowed down right after that. But I think parking is much better now than it used to be.
And before I leave downtown Biddeford, the Wonder Bar, that always seemed to have a reputation that I remember growing up like a political hotbed also, and anybody running for governor or senator or anything would always be making appearances at the Wonder Bars.
Yep.
Do you remember that? Did it influence you politically at all? And
well, of course, I remember the Wonder Bar because Spiris and Spencer Dragitas were in my class. So the Dragitas family owned the Wonder Bar. So I was well aware of it politically, and I'd hear stories about it. But I wasn't big in politics. I mean, whatever I ran for in high school, I lost. It's like, geez, I wasn't the most popular kid in the class, And it wasn't until I got out of college when Dave Redmond pulled me aside and asked me to run for the city council. Back then, of course, politics was a little bit weird in Biddeford. There were no Republicans.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah. It was, people had Republican philosophies, but they were listed as Democrats. And you had factions within the party. So when there was an election, there were tickets. And so when he convinced me to run, and he convinced my father actually to run for the police commission, he convinced me to run. I ended up on the Chris Anton ticket.
I don't know Chris Anton running for anything.
Oh yeah, he ran for mayor. I
don't remember that at all.
He and Willie Palm Bryant and Dave Redmond and that core group, had some issues with Babe Dutremble, and so they decided to run against him. And so they put together this ticket, and if you could fill the ticket, that was a sign of strength. And so they got me to run, and Chris actually. So this would be 1975. I graduated from college in '74. I was writing all of Chris's stuff, all his literature and everything, and driving him around because he had some operation, so he couldn't drive. So I was chauffeuring.
Was this a paid position?
No, of course not. Nothing was paid. And if I had a blue Chevy van, I'm driving him in a Chevy van, and I had stickers on my car, on my truck, But I won by like 8 or 9 votes, against an incumbent, and then there was a recount. And so Willie Palm Bryant, who was really into the minutiae of politics, said, "Alan, you're gonna have to go to the recount." "Willie, I can't go to the recount. I got to teach." "You got to go because you never know what's going to happen." "Willie, what could possibly go wrong?" And he started telling me stories about how people used to put lead under their fingernails when they were counting. If they didn't like it, they'd just kind of scratch it so it would be thrown out. And I guess one time he caught somebody and hurdled a railing to go after the guy, and he got arrested. I mean, Biddeford politics was wild apparently before this. Got me a little nervous, but I still didn't go. And I ended up winning. I picked up votes. I think I won by 11 or 12. And I loved it. I just found that I love politics, and just the whole idea about policy and helping people just.
So when you look back at that, and this goes with the Catholic question, 90% Catholic, 90% Democrat, pretty close numbers and everything. Do you think that at least initially gave you a narrower view of life or politics or anything with that upbringing? How did that influence you, if it did at all?
I think the idea of giving back came out of that. I mean, growing up Catholic, going to a Catholic school, there was always this idea of service. Being in Boy Scouts, service again. So I think that was part of it. But like I said, if you would have asked me when I was in high school, would I be in politics? No way. I mean, it just was not on my radar whatsoever. In fact, staying in Biddeford wasn't even on my radar. You know, my plan was to move someplace or find something else to do. But once I got immersed in politics and once I started teaching, which again was supposed to be a 5-year job, it ended up being like 35. I was like, I love this stuff. And so I stuck around.
Interesting. I said I was going to leave downtown Biddeford, but I'm not because you brought up Casavant. So were you a bowler growing up at all? We had 2 great bowling alleys in downtown Biddeford.
We all bowled a little bit. I was terrible. You know, I was just, I don't know if I broke 100, I guess it was a good day. But my father, whenever he had a vacation, he used to take, he'd have like, we'll say 2 weeks off or something. He'd take him 1 day or 2 days at a time. He never took consecutive weeks. He just figured he could time it better for weather purposes. But one of the things we'd always do is go to the Big 20 bowling alley and bowl.
Oh, in Scarborough?
Yeah. So that was a ritual. He used to take us to the Elks to pay his dues, and he'd have a drink in the bar. We get something with cherries in it. I have no idea.
And that bowling alley was owned by the Antons also,
Yeah.
correct? Yeah. So
Yeah,
they
Big
had
20 's Chris.
Pastime and they had Big 20, correct?
Yeah, pastime and Big
Yeah.
20.
Yeah.
And
the
Nick Gillis had the 20th
20th
century.
century.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I bowled at those occasionally as well.
Yeah.
But I liked it. I liked bowling a lot.
So what about your teenage years, junior high and, well, you were at St. Mary's, but I mean, in high school, I mean, what were they like for you socially? You know?
Well, I left St. Mary's in my 8th grade. My father and my mother got convinced that the education would be better in the public schools because a lot of the textbooks that we had at St. Mary's were getting old. And I remember him having a conversation. I was right there with Father Goen, whether it made sense, and essentially was, do the best you can. Go if you want. So I transferred to the junior high, my 8th grade. I didn't like the junior high at all. I mean, I was completely lost. I didn't know many people there, and was trying to acclimate. The academics, in some cases, were more advanced. So, for example, in math, they put me in an accelerated program with Miss Poley.
Sarah Jane Poley.
Sarah Jane Poley, yeah. So I had that, but I wasn't too thrilled. So I spent my 8th grade and my 9th grade at the junior high school. Not my best years.
So the freshmen were still housed at the junior high
Yeah.
at that time? I'll come back and talk about that in a few minutes. Dances, there used to be a lot of high school Saturday night dances in Biddeford. Did you ever go to any of those? Or?
Some. I mean, I remember going to a couple in junior high. And of course, at high school, there were more dances. And I remember dances at St. Joseph's Parish Hall, which was always interesting because you try to explain this to people away from Biddeford about how there'd be people dancing and everybody else is walking around in a circle.
Girls were dancing, guys were walking.
Yeah. But, so I remember going to the St. Joe's Parish Hall there a number of times, and high school dances as well.
And did you participate in music or performing arts or anything like that when you were in high school?
Music, forget it. I mean, I couldn't carry a tune, couldn't play an instrument. Art, my stickmen are terrible. I got drafted to be in the senior play. Roger Painchot convinced me to do that because somebody dropped out, they were sick or something. So I had like maybe 4 or 5 lines, and that was it. That was the end of my drama experience. I was just so glad to get out of there after that was done, but I didn't do that at all. I played some sports, but I was limited because I was so tiny. I never cracked 100 pounds till I was a freshman in high school. I was short and skinny.
When did you gain all your height?
My senior year. I remember my
that's
mother
unusual.
complaining because she had to keep buying me new pants because I kept shooting up. I went like from 5'8" to 6'1". So I played like 8th grade baseball and 9th grade baseball and stuff. Baseball was always my favorite. Tried some basketball too, but I just was too tiny.
Yeah.
And football, forget it, I'd get killed. So that was never an option.
What are your memories of the competitiveness of high school sports when you had, Thornton, Biddeford, and St. Louis, usually with good teams in most sports.
Oh, I used to love that. When I was in grammar school, I used to go with my uncle Don Pinette, who graduated from St. Louis, to the St. Louis games. And I remember going to see St. Louis play Thornton over there, where the drugstore is today in that field. So I was involved early. And then in high school, of course, there were some tremendous athletes when I was there. Like when I first moved to the high school as a sophomore, Roger Bollier was the halfback, and he was just incredible athlete. And then there was Dick LeMay and Leo Cantor and Roland Yee. I mean, you could go on and on with these great athletes.
A lot of St. Mary's kids there.
If you think about it, when I was at St. Mary's, at one point in time, Dick Saucier, Mike Landry, they were there. Eon, Mike, Roland,
Mike Minuti.
Mike Minuti was there.
Dick Crespi was a St. Louis kid, St. Mary's kid too.
Yeah, he was a little ahead of me, but
But another one that was a good athlete.
But if you look at the grammar schools, each school had its certain athletes that really excelled. It's just, you don't see that today. You don't see that same dedication to sports that you had back then. Maybe it's because that's all you had to do. But God, there were some tremendous athletes.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. Look at all of the different activities in sports, especially for females now, that weren't available back then.
Oh yeah, not at all. Very little. So, I loved going to those games. The Biddeford St. Louis games, Biddeford Thornton games are just incredible. Even when I was teaching, man, just loved those games.
What about summer jobs? What did you do for work in your summers when you were old enough to go to work?
Yeah, I started work. My first job was at Wonderland Arcade in Old Orchard Beach. I don't know if it was my sophomore year or my junior year. I got a call from a guy named Gillis Fecto. They needed somebody down there to help do the skee ball and things of that nature. And so, desperate for money, I said, sure, I go down there. And so I worked for Richard and Edna Smith, taking care of the pinball machines and the skee ball things. I made $1.25 an hour. And there was overtime, but there was no overtime pay. It was still $1.25 an hour because that's the way the rules were. And so I used to work 40, 50, 60 hours a week, and just sock that money away. And I remember how cheap things were. I remember Steve Randall, who was a great gymnast. He was working across the street at a place that sold clams, and I get deals from him in terms of. Even then it was like $1.50 or $2 for a clam dinner. Just unbelievable. Anyway, so I did that for 2 years, and then I got a chance to work at the AMP, and that would be $3.15 or $3.25 an hour. So I started working at the AMP in Biddeford. And I knew some of the people that worked there, like Lucky Chenard and Joe Zook, and so I knew some of the older people, and some of my friends started working there.
Was that when it was still downtown, or
no? It was up
where the Sampsons used to be.
Next to Giant, across from So that's where I started working, and I found I really liked it. I worked in produce, and I was good at it, and so I worked there right through high school. I started off at USM in college because I wanted to keep working. So I'd work 30 hours a week at the AMP and go to school. And then it wasn't until my junior year I transferred up to Orono. But and then I'd come back, work summers, and I still was working at the AMP. So those are my two big jobs, actually.
And how did growing up and being educated in Biddeford prepare you for college and eventually to go away when you left?
I found I was fine. I had no issues because, again, I could read and I could write really, really well. And I had the discipline enough to be able to keep at it, I realized that quickly when I went up to Orono, when all of a sudden I had all this free time, and I saw a lot of my friends, Alan, there's a party, let's go. And I'm like, I got a test tomorrow. So do I, that's okay. But I think academically, I was all set. I was taught really, really well.
So when you came out, you started by substitute teaching before you get into a regular position. Is that correct?
Yeah, I majored in psychology in college, and it wasn't until my senior year in college that I'm like, I don't want to go into psychology. No, this is not going to be it for me. And I always had this hankering for teaching. When I was a senior, I was in Future Teachers of America. There were certain teachers that resonated with me for various reasons. Joe Carrier was one, because I learned from him his wit. He had this great wit. Oh, he was a disciplinarian. I mean, he was like Attila the Hun in the classroom. But there was something about him that just made it a little bit fun. Ruth Houghton and Shirley Bissell, math teachers, again, they had something. Roger Pancho could make anybody laugh. And I recognized, geez, when you laugh in the classroom, you seem to learn a lot faster. Dick Jakes was like that as well. And so there were teachers that just stood out in my head. There were some teachers that I never wanted to be like, but I thought that I could do that job. And so my senior year in college, all of a sudden I'm taking, stupidly, 21, 22 credit hours for 2 semesters. And you might say, what the hell were you thinking? But there was something.
Was that to change your major?
Because I had to get enough social studies credits in order to get certified. They had something called contract grading back then. And they probably got rid of it because it didn't work so well. It worked great for me because I would have 2 classes at the same time. But as part of the contract, I'd put, I'm not coming to your class, but I will do this for this particular grade. And so I could pull it off, so I could get those education classes done without prolonging going after I graduated. Even after I graduated, I had to take, I don't know, maybe 4 other history classes so I could get certified, because even though some psychology classes were transferable into the social studies certificate, I needed some more history classes. So then it was like, God, what am I going to do? I'll take those classes and I'll keep working. So I did some substitute teaching early on. I also went to work at Samson's Supermarket. This is when I was running Chris Anton's campaign. I did Samson's Supermarket, frozen food and dairy. That didn't go well.
And that's the one that was up by 5 points too, right?
Yeah. That didn't go well. I had a few run-ins, and the classic one that I remember is that we were short-staffed. It seemed like typical, always short-staffed. So anyway, I had to unload the dairy cases, dairy truck, and there were 24 cases of eggs that came in. So I was unloading those. Suddenly, they're buzzing for me to go up front and bag. So I'm putting them all on the pallet. I run up and I'm bagging, and so forth. It just so happened that the regional manager was in, and nobody liked him. But he came up. He had this sour look on his face, and I remember thinking, somebody's in trouble now. And then the manager's like, all herky jerky and stuff, and they come to me, come with me. Like, what the heck did I do? Go out back. The pallet broke, all those eggs flipped, and there was a yellow river going down the back room. And they told me, you're going to clean every one of those eggs. And so I had to wash every single one individually from all the broken shells and the yolk and clean out all the cases and put them back in, which is okay. But then when the manager checked in on me, he started giving me grief, and I told him, don't egg me on. And he got really mad. I said, sorry, I'm just joking around. That was it. I got fired the following Saturday.
Did you really say?
Yes. That was the end of that career. So then there was more substituting.
Did you student teach down here or up near Orem?
I did down here.
Where did you do your student teaching?
At Biddeford High, under Dave Kerry, which was kind of interesting because they did a special deal for me because Mark Scheibels was this educator, really well respected and up at Orono, and he agreed to supervise me while I was down here. So Dave, who was coaching football at the time, agreed to have me do that. So the first day, I'm nervous as hell because I got to teach world history. I had not taken any world history classes ever in my life, right? So I'm like reading a lot of stuff. So he introduces me, and he said, "This is, Mr. Casavant. He's going to take my place. He's a student teacher. Blah 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 blah. Take care." I never see him again. He didn't come in to check on me. He did that. I was like swimming by myself, but it was really good because I was at, my wit and I was scrambling, but I was learning my ropes very, very quickly. And fortunately, I had some really good kids, kids that I'm friendly with now, John Keneally and Keith Jakes and all these, it was good, but...
And it eventually led to a full-time job, correct?
Yeah, I did that, and then of course I was still taking some classes, but I eventually, by 76, I had my license, and at the time they were looking for a permanent substitute. They were having trouble getting substitutes, calling them up in the morning to teach, but they would have me always available, and they'd just shuffle me from school to school. So that's what I did my first year until I got a social studies job at the high school.
You were fortunate that, there was a plethora of teachers at that time on the market.
Yeah, it was. I kind of lucked out, but it worked out really, really, really well.
Was there one teacher that you had that you role modeled after, or who was your role model?
I had to speak over the weekend. I was telling people that I stole from a lot of people, So, like I mentioned, I stole from Roger Pancho because I found that his wit was good. And I would steal from Joe Carrier, and I'd steal from Dick Jakes and the Houghtons. There were certain ones that I would steal something. And then when I became a teacher, I stole from people like Bob Libby and Jim McCann who were teaching in the same area because I saw what they were doing that worked. So there was no one teacher. Well, maybe Spencer Trask. There was a guy science teacher named Spencer Trask that I thought he was just fabulous when I was a sophomore. But there were teachers like that. So I became a mishmash of what I thought would work in a classroom.
Now, when you started teaching, obviously the high school was still fairly new over there. It was a newer building, but most of the school buildings were older in Biddeford at that time. Probably Kennedy was a newer school, but you've seen really an evolution of going from these older buildings into these newer, really nice buildings in Biddeford. What are your thoughts on all of that? Does the building make that much of a difference, being in newer buildings?
It does. Yeah. My room wasn't that good. The windows leaked. If the wind blew, the curtains would move. Had asbestos tiles. In the late spring, it would get to be 90 degrees in my classroom. It wasn't an ideal situation. So I was in the old section of the high school, which was built in 61. And so I'm teaching 76, 77 through the 80s and into the 90s. It was tired, but the city never wanted to invest because, it's going to affect the tax rate. It's going to be a lot of money. And so they dragged it out for all that time. So inevitably it became more expensive to renovate the entire building than it had been to just maintain it correctly. And that's always been Biddeford's problem. We'll do it next year. We'll do it next year, but the next year never comes and it costs more. I remember on the council there was a time when we were supposed to do repair work up in the Round Hill area behind McDonald's, some sewer stuff. Too expensive. It was going to be like $200,000, $300,000. When they finally did it 5 or 6 years later, it was well over $1 million. So the buildings were tired. I think I always used to say I can teach anywhere, any place, and I think that's true. I don't think the building itself hindered my ability to teach. it's obviously nice if you have other things that more modern at your disposal. I think that enhances the education, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary.
And along with that, as time moved on, were class sizes then becoming smaller as the school, I'm assuming the school population was dipping over time also,
Yeah.
as you taught.
Yeah, and let's be honest, it's a lot easier to teach 10 kids than it is to teach 30.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
you can maintain better control and watch what kids are doing. So there's an advantage to that. The downside is that it costs money, you know. So if you're looking for bang for the buck, the more kids you pile into a classroom, the more affordable it is. The downside is the education will lag because of issues that arise. And like I said, today's issues are much more complicated than what I experienced when I first started in '76.
Yeah. And also, in addition to teaching, you were also coaching.
Yeah.
Correct? Can you talk a little bit about those experiences?
Well, that was another one. I stumbled onto those. So when I started teaching in '76, Brother Richard came up to me and asked me if I would be assistant hockey coach because he had heard I had played some hockey. And this was going to be a bit of his very first team. And for whatever reason, I agreed. It's like, and these kids were good because they went undefeated, and it was a heck of I had a ball. I had an absolute ball. But again, it wasn't on my radar. It wasn't something that I expected to do. And a lot of the coaching, again, was nurturing and just reinforcing, you know, the gifts that they had and making sure they stayed positive. And we use it for educational experiences too, that you can a lot of life lessons can be taught through coaching. And there were some kids that probably, had they not played hockey, would probably been in a lot of trouble. But hockey kept them focused and kept them active in the classroom. Soccer was even more bizarre. Bob Libby was the head coach. He could not find an assistant coach. He came up to me, "You'll love it, Alan. It's almost like hockey. You got to help me." The day before I was supposed to start, he took me to the first soccer game I ever saw in my life. I had no idea how to play soccer. I had never played soccer. I never saw a game. And I was coaching, reading a lot of books about what to do. And I ran hockey plays. That's all I could do.
Was there a rivalry when they brought those programs on? You know, you're taking people away from basketball, taking people away from football when those sports were introduced?
That was always the fear.
Yeah.
In fact, even when hockey first started, that was one of the whispers, you know. That means that kids aren't going to go out for basketball or something like that. But the reality is they're totally different animals. You know, my soccer team, the average weight might have been 105 pounds. They're not playing football. You know, there's no way. And my hockey team, kind of a funny story about that, when I started coaching with them, I had to lie about the ages because they were so tiny. I had to add, not ages, but the weights. They were so tiny that I'd add 20 pounds to get up to 130, you know. But those kids had gone through the youth program. They weren't interested in other sports. So this was a different avenue than, they would never have played basketball or anything else. They played hockey. So that was just, you know, I've learned over time that when something new happens, people in opposition go worst case scenario every single time to try to say this is not going to work. And worst case scenario rarely, if ever, occurs.
What was your biggest lesson or takeaway from coaching sports?
I would say the biggest lesson I learned is that there's great satisfaction in doing the best you can. You don't always win, but if you give it your all, you feel pretty good about it.
So a really positive experience for you.
Oh God, yeah. I mean, we didn't, aside from that first year, some of the other teams that I coached, there was a little bit more difficult. You know, for example, when I became head coach, I remember that first year hearing how Lewiston High School had 100 and some odd kids trying out for hockey. I had like 23. It's like, this is not going to go well. But they never quit. They worked hard, and so it was rewarding for me, you know. And for most of them, I remain friends with them right to this time. I still stay in touch.
Let's talk a little bit about politics or your political career. You talked a little bit about how you got involved initially in politics. What about some of your experiences on city council, state legislature, before we talk about your mayoral history?
So when I first got on the city council, I was, I think, 22. And I wasn't the youngest. Dick Lambert was the youngest. I think he was 18. And Billy Zook might have been 20, 21. Little interesting sidebar there. Billy Zook's name is William Joseph Zook. He succeeded his father, who was Joseph William Zook. People thought they were voting for the father. But anyway, most of the time, this was when Babe Dutrouble was mayor. And I learned a lot from Babe. Babe had a way with people, and that was one of the things I stole from him, is how to get along with people. Most of the votes back then were 8-3. You know, they called us the Young Turks. It seemed like we were always in trouble. And this was the time, what's really cool, there were 3 newspapers in the audience every single meeting. The York County Star, the Press Herald, and the Journal Tribune. They were always there. And not only were they there, they'd write a story. On Thursday, they'd do a follow-up. They'd call you again to see what you wanted to say, and so they'd print again. Whereas today, you never see a press there whatsoever. It's vacant, which is a huge loss, because I can easily argue that those first years, everybody in Biddeford knew exactly what was going on because they were reading the same paper. And now, nobody has a clue what's going on.
Actually, you jumped ahead to a question I had at the end, is not having a local daily paper, you know.
It's unbelievable how bad it is without having a paper. I mean, the Press Herald's still there, but they'd rarely do an article in Biddeford. And when I was mayor, I had so many complaints. Well, we didn't know. I mean, it's on the webpage, it's on Facebook, it's on, I mean, all this stuff is there, but the average person, even me now, we never go there. You know, so people have no idea what's going on or the complexity of what's going on. But back then, it was good. Everybody knew. One of the first things that I think of when I looking back was significant was the purchase of St. Louis Field. Marty Riley was the mayor, and the St. Louis Alumni Association they were going to sell it. Because they wanted to get out of the business of running the fields. They couldn't do it anymore. Everybody was aging. And the threat was it was going to be housing development.
What year was that, Alan? Do you remember?
Had to be, Marty was a mayor somewhere like late 70s, early 80s, somewhere in there. Mm-hmm. And I think the price was $300,000. And they wanted that money. And Marty wasn't too keen on that because, you know, that's a lot of money. We don't have it. And I remember helping to actually brokering the deal. I came up with the idea that St. Louis agreed on $100,000 a year, no interest for 3 years. And so that whole complex was preserved. And I remember that because, again, if you remember what I said a little while ago, the whole idea of getting pleasure out of making things like that, making it click. That's what I like about politics. You know, the art, I shouldn't say I'm making a deal because it kind of sounds like somebody's book that I don't particularly enjoy. But that's the benefit of doing politics, is being able to do something like that, you know.
A great gift to the community.
Yeah. And so that, the expansion of Biddeford Pool, I mean, that happened during Babe's tenure as well. Gil Bush had bought it, but it came to fruition after because of lawsuits and things of that nature. I mean, that was a milestone as well. Just cool stuff.
Yeah. And you mentioned in the information you gave me about the charter change banning teachers.
Oh,
what was that all about? 1994, I think you said.
Oh, man. I served 18 years on the city council. I ran 9 times and I won 9 times. I served at Ward 5.
Different from high school.
I served as a Ward 5 counselor and then at large. And obviously when you win or when you're in politics for any length of time, you make enemies. And so a charter commission got formed that was made up or allied with people that I had beaten over time, and they thought that it was not right that a teacher should be on the council that votes on a school budget. Okay, it's a conflict of interest. So now, sometimes in the past, I'd abstain. I mean, you see the school budget once a year. That's it. Councilors don't get involved in the way the school operates. So there was a wall there. There always was a wall there. So like I said, generally I used to abstain. A couple of times I voted when I thought that nobody seems to understand what's being said here or whatever. But anyway, so it's a referendum. It passes. You know, unofficially it was called the Casavant rule because it was targeted for me to get me off the council.
You were the only teacher on at that time?
Yeah, but others had in the past. Kitty Goodrow had done it, for example, so she was there. So teachers up to this day cannot serve on the council if they're actively teaching in Biddeford because of what happened.
What about your experiences with the state legislature? How did you do that in teaching?
I prefer local, you know, because quite frankly, nobody has a clue what you're doing up in Augusta. You know, and the other thing that's really irritating to me is that it's so partisan. At the local level, nobody cares if you're a Republican or a Democrat. All it is taxes and services. And if you do something really good, people really know that and can respond. If there's something really bad, they can go ballistic very quickly, and that's part of the deal, the trade-off. But it's better because at least people are engaged. So in the legislature, I'm not very partisan. I mean, on paper, I'm a Democrat, but in my head, I'm not really a Democrat. I saw the way the two parties work against each other in order to advance their own interests. So, in other words, the party in power does everything it can to maintain power. The party out of power does whatever it can to obtain power. And they do so by undermining the other side. I'll give you an example. We were debating, it was late in the session, and we were debating a bill to tax offshore bank accounts. Okay, so if a Maine had something in Caracas or whatever, I mean, we could tax it. It's going on for seemingly hours. And suddenly somebody on the other side, a Republican, gets up and says, I don't know why we're talking about this because we can't control it anyway. It's a federal issue. And I'm looking like, we're talking about this? And we can't. So I went to see the chairman of the committee that pushed this bill, a Democrat. And I said, is it true that we can't do anything about it? He goes, yeah. Then why are we doing it? Because we want to make the Republicans vote against it so we can use it in the next campaign. And I'm like, you're kidding me. Both sides do that. And that's the problem with partisan politics, you know. So local is, you don't see that. You don't see that. You don't see the games that can play. I mean, I had people come up to me and say, why are you hanging around with so-and-so? He's a Republican. He's my friend. And I had my Republican friends, why are you hanging around with Casavant? He's one of them. He's my friend. It gets crazy. And of course, you get to the federal level, it's even nuttier. So I think looking back at the legislative years, the greatest thing that I thought that we passed, at least it's coming to mind right now, is when we changed the tax system to make it more balanced between property taxes and sales taxes and income taxes. Because Maine's economy has changed. It's a service economy, not an industrial economy like it used to be. I thought that was good, but the Democrats that pushed this did one small mistake. They had no Republican support at all. And so it was seen as being something driven by Democrats, and then there was a referendum sponsored by Republicans to kill it, and it got killed. But that's some of the problems that you see at that particular level.
And what about your experiences as mayor? I mean, you served for a long time. I mean, what are some of your memories of all of that?
Oh God, there's a lot of good memories.
Yeah.
one of the things that I had in my head right at the very beginning is that I recognized that there was a lot of talent in City Hall. And I flashed back to when I was coaching hockey, and I think it was my last year. Lewiston had just hired a new coach at the last minute. He was a football coach. He had never played hockey, had never done anything like that. And I went up to him and I said, "How are you going to do this? You never played the game. You know, you're a football coach. How are you going to do this?" He says, "Alan, I have the horses. I'm going to let them run." That guy won the state title. He had the horses. And I realized that if I can argue that letting the horses in City Hall run, City Hall will prosper, the city will prosper. And so that was my attitude, is to let them do what they're supposed to do and not interfere, or manipulate, or, I'm not an expert in that stuff. Let the experts do some stuff. So right out of the gate, one of the biggest issues we had was Maine Energy, right? There was pressure, not pressure, but they wanted to sell it. And the question was, should we do that? Now, there was all types of opposition, right? People that were employed there were upset. People were afraid it was going to hurt the tax base because they were the biggest taxpayers in Biddeford at the time. And, oh my God, we're going to pay more tax. Worst case scenario again. But it seemed like with all the negative publicity, and the publicity was not just in the press, there was also a subtle psychological issue going on in the background. So athletically, for example, on the field you hear of trash talk. Literally, it was trash talk. "Oh, Biddeford, you guys stink. You smell all that." They were saying that on the field. And so that whole attitude had permeated the psychology of Biddeford. I think it took our mojo away a lot. So in my head, the only way to reverse that was to get rid of it. And I also recognize that if you got rid of it, and got rid of the stigma, because of the bones that I talked about earlier with architecture and history in the downtown area, it could regenerate itself. The downtown could revitalize. Now, I just want to get back to Maine Energy for a minute, because one of the things that people don't understand is why it was there. People forget that in the 1970s, there was an oil crisis. There was also an issue with Biddeford's landfill leaking, and so something had to be done. It was either a landfill or incinerator. There was no other choice. There were no options, and landfilling seemed to be not too environmentally sound based on the geological studies in the Biddeford area. There was competition between Biddeford, Saco, and Old Orchard where this thing was going to be sited, because whoever had it would get the biggest chunk of the tax revenue, the better deal. The first site chosen was in Saco. It was on Saco Island. Saco won this whole thing. But then something happened. Saco Lowell closed. And that's a key, because part of the deal was, the promise is that not only would this incinerator burn trash and create electrical power, it would also distribute steam to the businesses in the area, so it would be more affordable. They wouldn't need to buy oil, for example. With Saco Lowell closing, that whole idea went out the window. So they had to look at another spot, and that's where Maine Energy ended up going, in Biddeford.
Now, Saco Low was up on North Street where Miramont is now, is that correct?
Yeah.
Where they were then? Okay, just
Yeah.
give people perspective geographically where
Yeah.
it was located.
Yeah, I made a mistake. I should be saying Saco Tanning.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Saco
say
Tanning.
Saco Low,
Okay,
yeah.
on the
So
on the hill there.
Yeah, Saco Tanning
Yeah.
is what closed, and they're the
Okay.
ones that were going to get that steam. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
So it goes to Biddeford. Now, there was a lot of controversy about even putting it there, even though a lot of the buildings that were going to be demolished were dilapidated and whatever. The company that was going to build the waste to energy plant took people down to New York to see the plant. Arthur Lavoie went, Dick Potvin went, some other councils went, they went down there to see this. I remember Dick coming back telling me, Alan, the place is so clean you can eat off the floor. It was a different type of plant than what they built here. It was a classic bait and switch. And that was another thing that's important to recognize about Biddeford. Biddeford historically didn't want to spend any money on experts, so they did things in-house. And really, there was nobody in-house that could deal with these large companies that were creating or building these incinerators. Didn't have the expertise. And so when the plant got built, it was underbuilt and didn't satisfy any of the environmental standards that everybody thought was going to be there. And it stunk. So getting rid of it at that point, when I first became mayor, seemed to be something that was needed on an economic level and a psychological level, because otherwise we weren't going to be able to move forward. But what happened was, faster than I ever imagined, is once we announced that was going to close and the city was going to take it over, there was tremendous interest in all the mills. And all of a sudden, Nathan Zanton's building stuff, Doug is doing stuff, Tim Harrington eventually comes on. None of those things would have happened had that plant stayed open. And I remember a reporter from the Journal Tribune coming up to me, Alan, this is like the first year, right, of me being mayor. What are you going to do for an encore? Can you ever match anything like this? And I was like, geez, I don't think so. But we did other things that probably came up to it.
Would that be the single most impactful event that happened when you were in office, do you think?
It was a catalyst for what I thought was the biggest impact. The biggest impact was the way that people at Biddeford began to believe in the downtown and themselves again, so that people began to brag about being in Biddeford. So if you looked at Facebook, we'll say in 2010, where do you live? People from Biddeford put in the Portland area. People were not willing to say they lived in Biddeford because it was embarrassing. But now, people brag about Biddeford, right? I mean, I remember, I knew we hit it when somebody showed me an ad from Kennebunk. It was a hotel or a restaurant, and they put down, we're 5 minutes from Biddeford. Bingo, I knew we had that. You would not have had that 15 years ago. No way. People avoided Biddeford, the downtown, but now, and that's, I think, what I'm most proud about, is that I turned the corner and got people to believe in themselves again. But that's the same as teaching. It's identical to teaching, except that, it involves repetition. I had to repeat that. I remember when Tim Harrington wanted to come here and do the Lincoln, I posted on Facebook, and people, you're a liar, he's never going to come here, Biddeford's no good, but interestingly, when he had his big grand opening, they were there, but I didn't say anything, but they were there in that audience too. But that's what we had to turn that around. And the other interesting point is, the people who believed that Biddeford could turn the corner generally were people from away. They were not from people who lived in Biddeford. They were from New York and Boston and whatever, and they opened up the shops and the restaurants and so forth because they believed that Biddeford's glass was half full, whereas many of the people in Biddeford, it was always half empty. Poor, pitiful me, we can never be anything, and so forth. So there was a psychology involved here in terms of creating self-esteem.
Absolutely. I'd like to ask you a little bit about the history of mayors in Biddeford, and I don't know what knowledge you have of that or anything with your education background, but who were some of the more impactful mayors in Biddeford, in your opinion? In a positive way, obviously.
Oh, yeah. Michael Quintara, he brought a elevated level of professionalism to City Hall, I think. Extremely politically savvy. He could diffuse situations with humor and intellect. So he was very critical when he became mayor, circa 1988, 89, somewhere in there. Bonnie Pothier was just as gifted as he was. Sometimes got in trouble politically because for her, she wanted to do what was right and didn't care about the political consequences. And so whereas Michael would kind of like cajole and kind of, manipulate a little bit, Bonnie was like, this is the way it is, and we got to do it. But those were things that were needed. Gil Bushy, in terms of just getting the beach, I mean, that was visionary. I mean, obviously not popular in some areas, but I mean...
Well, not popular for the...
Yeah.
It's a bit of a pull.
But there's a legacy to it.
Yeah.
There's a mayor called George Precourt that was beloved in the 1920s. He was a doctor, a very giving doctor, and he had this, this right around the Great Depression time and stuff, but he was very popular. He died when he left office. And I guess I've seen a picture of his funeral. It's just everybody's out there.
Yeah.
I mean, he was just beloved, and I think he was big. Babe had a way with people.
Okay.
He and I butted heads a number of times, but we remained friends right through it all. And I would say he had a genius for understanding people and trying to do what was best.
What about the legacy of Mayor Luzia? I have to ask you that. I mean, we're the last generation that probably remember any stories about him.
Well, he was the longest serving mayor, and he had passed a long time before me. But I mean, I've heard the same stories. I mean, the classic one being, God put the snow there, let God take it away. Literally, sidebar about that. I was talking to a guy once about Papa Lozier, and he told me, he says, I was the reporter that did that story. His name was Con Carvanides. I said, what are you talking about? Con says, I worked for the paper, and they told me it was late at night, call the mayor up and talk about the snowstorm. I guess a real big snowstorm. So he calls up the mayor, wakes him up, and the mayor blurted that out, and Cod wrote it down verbatim, and it was in the paper. Lozier never talked to Carvanides again. He was so ticked off at him. So that's a true story. But he was the last of the boss mayors. I mean, he controlled essentially everything. And that's the other thing that people should know, is that the power of the mayor has really been diluted and diluted. So for me, even though I get blamed for everything that was bad, generally speaking, I had limited no powers. I remember John McCurry always telling me, John was a council with me, vote of 5, Alan, vote of 5. 5 councils that would dictate what's going to happen. And he's right. My only job, or even Marty, at this time, the job is essentially promoting Biddeford and nudging the popular will in a certain direction, because you can't unilaterally do anything anymore, which is too bad.
The other mayor I wanted to ask you about was Clement DeChambeau. He was the one, or under his administration, that the high school got built.
Yeah.
And right across the street from where he lived.
In fact, it's kind of funny you say that, because I went to an event over the weekend, and there was a woman there who was talking. She had done some of the setup, and she was telling me that she was related to him, and she was telling me the story about how he owned the land across the street and where they lived and all this other stuff. So, yeah, and I think he passed away. There was some issue regarding kickbacks or something. I don't remember exactly what it was, but he passed away before anything transpired. I think that's when the Biddeford got a Republican mayor, Willie Pomerleau, right after. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Again, we don't have too many Republican mayors.
And you may not know any history of this, but I've always wondered, I'm going to ask you, is the athletic field across from the high school, I don't know if you remember, that was always called the Soccer Low field. And it was a baseball field. Kids would play football there sometimes. Always trying to figure out what was the relation to Soccer Low with it. If they ran a league there, or
I don't know. I never heard that.
Okay, I just thought you might know.
But Biddeford had a lot of old fields. Yeah. I mean, where Prospect Manor is today. I remember Father Goen taking us out for St. Mary's baseball team to play baseball out there.
Prospect Park.
Yeah.
Did you ever see Father Goen swing a bat?
Tell you a story about this. I was an altar boy, And every summer, they would take all the boys to Camp Gregory and to swim and have a picnic and stuff like that. And so there was going to be a baseball game. And Father O'Toole and Father Gowan were going to be there. Everybody, all the older boys wanted Father O'Toole on their side because he was young, this should be great. And Father Gowan's got his cassock on and his white hair and stuff. He gets up into the plate and he hits it over the trees. And we're like, what the heck just happened? And he's running around with his cactus plant, giggling like a little girl and stuff like that. And then I learned later that, yeah, he was a heck of a baseball player. Never knew it.
Good man, too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's a good man.
Yeah, do the best you can. 7 Our Fathers, 7 Hail Marys.
We like to ask in these interviews folks' memories of different, historical events. Where were you when Kennedy got assassinated?
I was in the 6th grade at St. Mary's School, and it's going to sound weird. The principal comes in. Of course, remember, the same in parochial school, Kennedy's picture was everywhere. I mean, he was a Catholic president, so this is really important. The principal comes in and says that Kennedy's been shot. We're dumbfounded. The teacher that I had was stunned. This one kid gets up and claps. Yeah.
In the 6th grade?
Yeah. He had transferred to Biddeford, I think in the 5th grade. I remember him in the 5th grade. He was extremely odd. Today, a psych evaluation would say there was something a little bit off, but back then it was just, he was odd. I mean, he always wore a tan jacket, tan pants, white shirt, and a bow tie that reeked of turpentine and gasoline. He'd have a pork chop or something in his pocket unwrapped and he'd pick it up and eat it. I mean, real odd guy. So he gets up and claps and everybody turns around looks at him and just bewildered. And I don't know, he said something, but I remember vaguely that some of the kids in my class beat him up behind where the AMP used to be on Main Street, somewhere in there. I mean, just, yeah, that's the memory that I have of that. And I remember Oswald being shot because we were down in the yard playing football. My brother-in-law, my father said, he's been shot. Just unbelievable.
What I didn't ask you about any memories your parents might have had, or did your father serve during World War II and Depression and that, folks being brought up in the Depression? Were there any stories from that that you remember?
My father wasn't in the military during World War II because when he was born, the doctor broke his arm, so his arm was always shorter. So he was 4F, which he said proved to be an advantage because there were no guys around, so there were plenty of girls available, so he could date quite a few. And allegedly, according even his teachers, but he was older because I guess he was the baby of the family, so he was spoiled, and he used to get in trouble quite a bit, so that his mother sent him to Stella Maris for a little bit to try to get him under control. And then I think he went to Florida. He quit school, went to Florida, and lived down there for a year before he came back. So the military, no, but my other uncles were in the military. Like I said, my Uncle Dickie got killed overseas. I had some cousins that were in the Philippines, the Nicole family, that were captured by the Japanese. They were agents of Pepperell Manufacturing, and they were in prisoner of war camp and eventually got liberated. And part of the liberating forces was my Uncle Paul from Biddeford. So there's that story as well. As far as the Depression, my mother's family lived up on the mountain road, and they were somewhat self-sufficient. They had a farm, and the CV family lived next door with a farm. I remember my mother telling me that my grandmother had some silver dollars, no, gold. There were gold coins that she had to pawn off to get some money to make ends meet. You know, on the Casavant side, I always heard a story, and I don't know how true it was, about how my grandfather and his family had a restaurant that closed during the Depression. And
Was that in Biddeford?
yeah. And that my grandmother's spaghetti recipe came from that restaurant. So I don't know. I don't know how true that is, but
Did they talk about the mill closings at all? Do you have any vague memories when they first started closing in Biddeford?
I don't really.
No.
I don't have much
Yeah.
about the mills at all. I remember working one summer in Biddeford Textile and swearing I would never ever go back again because I could not even imagine how people worked in there because it was so hot and sticky and noisy. It was just such tough work, and I remember people bragging, I've been here 25 years or 30 years, or the Saco Tanning was the same way. People were there forever, and today you would say, I'm not working there. But they had to support a family, so they did what they had to do, so you have to admire that.
Yeah, you do. And do you remember the fires in 1963, Grafton Lumber and Hooper Street and St. Mary's School?
Oh,
Do you
yeah.
remember any of that?
I remember all of them. St. Mary's School, I was so psyched because no school. That was wrong. We didn't miss a day, I don't think.
We did.
And I remember Hooper Street and Grafton. I remember my dad actually bringing me down behind St. Mary's Church. And I remember the telephone lines where Champions is today. The lines were on fire. Just amazed by all that. And they were all in rapid succession. So, yeah. I remember my dad actually bringing me and showing me all of that.
So, Alan, what is, in your mind, the current perception of Biddeford?
Say it again.
The current perception of Biddeford.
I think Biddeford today is viewed as an up-and-coming place. It's a place that's desirable to live, and that's really good. But there's nothing in this world is perfect. There's a flip side to that. Biddeford has become so popular today that the cost of living here is through the roof. So buying a house here, trying to find a house here or land here is just crazy. Now COVID had something to do with it. Being able to work remotely had something to do with that. I mean, my neighbors across the street are from Massachusetts. They just moved here. Down the street, there's another family that are working remotely. I mean, it's an advantage, but that puts pressure on the housing stock here, so it's very difficult. We hear the term gentrification a lot. Certainly that has happened to some degree in Biddeford. But again, you got to remember that 15, 20 years ago, there was a lot of substandard housing in Biddeford. I mean, really difficult places in which to live, a lot of poverty. And that's been balanced out to some degree. So I think there's good reason to be proud of living in Biddeford with a university, a good school system, a vibrant downtown. You can do just about anything, the beaches, good library. So bottom line is it's a really good place to raise a family.
And how has your life turned out so far compared to how you would have envisioned it as a youngster or a young adult?
It didn't turn out at all the way I expected. What's the Grateful Dead thing? A long, strange way. I don't know what it is, but anyway, I've had a lot of twists and turns. I mean, when my sister died, that rocked me. I mean, I was a senior in high school, and that just, I don't remember most of my senior year because I was going to and fro the hospital, and I got big gaps in my memory there. But I had visions at that point. I was because again, I talked about writing, I was going to do journalism or something like that. And I veered away from that because my first year at USM, there was a teacher named Saldana who taught psychology. And his opening lines every day was, "Vivazai." He had a photographic memory, and he didn't have notes. He'd just go right off, and he was just incredibly smart. And so I thought that's what I wanted to do, go into psychology. And then, like I said, my senior year in college, like, I don't want to do this. So I scrambled to do teaching. And that my goal was 5 years, and then I'll move on and do something, somewhere else. But I ended up liking the kids and liking the parents and liking the challenge. Then I got in politics on top of that.
Which you
and then
never saw coming.
No, and coaching I never saw coming. I mean, all of a sudden I'm doing all these things that weren't part of my repertoire, and I'm doing all this stuff. Running for the legislature, that was never on my radar until it was like, I'd like to give that a shot. And being mayor, well, that wasn't quite something that I planned either. And here I sit now, retiring, where my biggest challenge is walking the two dogs, and I'm like, geez, I don't know. What's next?
What is something you would like people to take away from hearing your story?
I think that you can plan your life as best you can, but there's no guarantee that's the way it's going to be, and you got to roll with the punches. And you just do the best you can with what you're handed.
And is there anything you would like to share that we haven't talked about today?
Not that I can think of.
Well, thank you, Alan. On behalf of the Biddeford Cultural and Heritage Center, we really appreciate you sharing your story with us today.
Oh, glad to do it. I enjoyed it.